Alright, y'all, I can't believe I'm actually really having to do this again, but I was spot listening to some of the episodes today, checking audio quality, and this past Monday's episode about Myra Hindley and Brady, you absolutely couldn't hear any of it. So I'm giving it another shot. Gonna re-record it for you. So I do apologize, and that's just not normally how we do things. And all I can say is that when I recorded it the other day and then edited, everything was fine. So I don't know, and I mean, it doesn't make sense at all. But anyway, let's get this thing started, and so you can find out finally what happened with Myra Hindley and Ian Brady. Alright, so as you guys know, over the past month or so, we've been spending Mondays talking about the Moore's murders. We've taken a different victim each week and talked about their specific murder. Last week we finished up with their final victim, and today we're going to be talking about the murderers themselves, Myra Hindley and Ian Brady. Now, as you can probably already guess, those two are some pretty sick tickets. I mean, you would have to be pretty sick to kill kids like that anyway. Now, Myra was raised by her grandmother, and around the age of 15, one of her very dear friends passed away, and it had a big effect on her. It caused her a lot of grief, so she decided to drop out of school, and then she started following the Roman Catholic faith. Well, when she was 19, she met Ian Brady, and they were actually co-workers. Brady had just recently been released from prison, and it seems that our Mr. Brady had committed some petty crimes and burglary. Well, Myra was quite smitten with Brady, and he had this strong power over her. She would have did anything he asked her to do, and she wrote one time that she hoped that he loved her and hoped to one day marry him. She also said that he could be cruel and selfish, but she loved him anyway. It was almost like she knew that he was bad for her, but she was so far pulled in by him that whatever he said was like poetry to her ears. Well, in the beginning, the two would go on dates to the movies to watch X-rated films. And then they'd go back to Myra's house to drink German wine. Well, shortly after they first started dating, Ian started giving her some reading material, and they would take their lunch breaks at work together so that they could just sit and read each other from Nazi horrors. Soon after that, and probably at Ian's request, Myra started bleaching her hair and wearing dark red lipstick to portray herself as the perfect Aryan woman. Now, not long after that, she started changing her appearance even more, because she started wearing leather jackets, short skirts, and thigh-high boots, and back in those days, that's what they called a Jezebel. Anyway, as a couple, Ian and Myra stopped being friendly with their co-workers, and soon the library would become their favorite hangout. They'd check out books from philosophy, or about philosophy, crime, and torture. And they'd also borrow books by Friedrich Nietzsche and other such authors. Sometime around July of 1963, Myra said that Ian started talking about he wanted to commit the perfect murder. And when he would talk about it, he would always reference the novel Compulsion by Mayer Levin. In that novel, two high society guys, they came from very affluent families, they attempt to commit the perfect crime, or the perfect murder of a 12-year-old boy, gosh. And because of their age, they avoid the death penalty. So the two set out to find their perfect victim, and on July the 12th of that same year, they came across Pauline Reed. Now, the sad thing about this is that Pauline knew Myra because She went to school with Myra's sister, Maureen, and not only that, she had dated David Smith for a short time. And if you remember from last week's episode, David's married to Maureen, and Ian called him to participate in that last murder that was committed. Well, after Pauline disappeared, David was questioned about it, but he was later cleared from any of the involvement. Well, 4 months later, they took their second victim, and that was John Kilbride. 2,000 volunteers searched for young John, but he was nowhere to be found. And I mean, how could you really find somebody when they're buried way out in the moors? They went from that November when John Kilbride was murdered to June 16th, 1964, before they would commit another crime. That is when Keith Bennett disappeared and was murdered. Keith's stepfather was questioned on 4 different occasions for his murder, but he was cleared. Now, shortly after that, Maureen and David got married, and Maureen was 7 months pregnant. Well, Myra didn't approve of their marriage at all, and maybe it was because she knew that David had been a petty criminal in the past, like Ian, and she was afraid that her sister would end up in the same situation that she was currently in. Well, anyway, the day they were married, the day after they were married, Ian thought it would be a good idea for the two couples to take a trip to Windermere. And this was really the first time the two men had met, but Ian seemed to be very impressed by the way David carried himself. Well, soon the two couples were hanging out more and more. Myra was actually a little jealous of the friendship that was forming between the two young men, but she was becoming more close to her sister, so there was, that, I guess, as a trade-off. When Myra and Ian moved into the infamous Wardlebrook home, they befriended a little girl that lived next door. Her name was Patricia Hodges, and sometimes they would go to the moors to collect peat to add to their own yard and take Patricia with them. Well, they never harmed little Patricia because she was their neighbor, and so the police probably would have linked them to that crime right away if they had hurt the little girl or did anything to her. So on Boxing Day of that year, which falls on December 26th, there was a fun fair at Ancoats. And what better place to find your next young victim than at a fair? And sure enough, they found their next victim standing all alone. Her name was Leslie Ann Downey, and she was only 10 years old. This would be the one that they would take back to their home on Wardlebrook. Once they were there, she was stripped, photographed, raped, tortured, and murdered. They even made an audio recording of that poor little girl begging for her mom and crying for them to stop. Now, we already knew they were savages, but that just cemented the fact that they were beyond savage. Now, the following morning, they drove Leslie Ann's body out to Saddleworth Moor, and they buried her there. And they didn't even give the poor child any dignity when they buried her either, because they buried her and she was nude, and they buried her the clothes that she had been wearing next to her feet. Now, it would be just over 9 months before they'd commit another murder, their final murder, and that was the murder of Edward Evans. On October the 6th of 1965, Myra drove in to the Manchester Central Railway Station, and just as she had claimed all the other times, she waited outside while Ian went in. Ian met up with 17-year-old Edward Evans, and Edward Evans was an apprentice engineer, and when he brought him to the car, he introduced Myra as his sister. Now, later, Ian mentioned that he had picked up Edward, for sexual activity, so maybe he didn't want Edward to know that Myra was actually his girlfriend, in case that would hamper any chances of a sexual encounter, or whatever you want to call it. From the railway station, they drove to that house on Wardlebrook, and when they got there, they all shared a bottle of wine and got to know each other. Now, it's unclear what happened to cause it, but at some point after they got home, Ian asked Myra to go pick up her brother-in-law, David. When Myra picked him up, she told him to wait outside until she gave the signal, and the signal was a flashing light. Well, when he saw the flashing light, he knocked on the door, and Ian answered the door and asked if he was there for the miniature wine bottles. And like I said in last week's episode, I believe that was just a ruse, just to throw Edward Evans off. But he left David standing in the kitchen and said that he was going to gather those bottles. What happened next was recounted by David when the police questioned him later. David said that he waited in the kitchen for a minute or two, and then he heard what he described as one hell of a scream. And he thought it was a scream from a woman because it was so high-pitched. Now, the screams just kept going on, and through those continuous screams, David heard Myra tell him to come help Ian, and when he went in that room, he saw Edward laying with his head and shoulders on the couch, and his legs were on the floor. Now, Ian was standing over, like kind of straddled over him, and he had a hatchet raised above his head in one of his hands. Well, he struck Edward on the left side of his head with that hatchet, and then Edward said that the sound of the strike of the hatchet against his head was just horrifying. Now, after that, Ian strangled Edward with an electrical cord, and somehow in all of the commotion, Ian ended up spraining his ankle. Edward was bigger than all of the other victims so far, so because of that and the sprained ankle, Ian couldn't move him without help. So David promised he'd come back the next morning with a baby pram so they could move Edward to the car, but for the meantime, they just wrapped him up in plastic and put his body in a spare room. David arrived back to his own house around 3 o'clock that morning, and when he got there, he was so shaken up that he asked his wife to make him a cup of tea. Well, once he had drank that cup of tea, he vomited, and he started telling his wife, Maureen, what he had witnessed at Ian and Myra's house. After that, he waited till daylight, and he armed himself with a screwdriver and a bread knife, and he walked to the closest phone box. A police car arrived at the phone box and drove Edward to the police station, and once he was there, Edward told them, not Edward, but David, sorry, I think I've said Edward several times, meaning David, but anyway, David told them what he had witnessed. Now, to get into this house and not tip off Myra or Ian that they were the police, one of the investigators dressed in a bread delivery man's overalls. He knocked on the back door and asked if her husband was home when Myra answered the door. Well, she responded that she wasn't married and there wasn't a man in the house. Well, after hearing that, the investigator explained who he was and asked to come in. From there, Myra led him to the living room where Ian was in there writing a note to his employer explaining that because of his ankle, he wouldn't be into work that day. The investigator explained why he was there, and he told them that they had had a report of some kind of violence involving guns taking place. Well, Myra told him that nothing had happened there, and she even allowed the police to take a look around the house. When they came to that spare bedroom, Myra said that the key for it was at her where she worked. So the police offered the driver to get that key, but Ian told her just to hand over the key. After checking out the room, Ian was arrested on suspicion of murder. And as he was getting dressed to go downtown, Ian told the police that he and Eddie, meaning Edward, had a row and things had gotten out of hand. Well, Myra wasn't arrested that day, but she did insist on going to the police station with Ian, and she took her dog. Now, why she took her dog, I'm not sure. But anyway, the only thing she would say about Edward's death was that it was an accident. They let her go back home after that, but they had her promise that she'd come back the next day. Now, a couple of times, Myra went to her place of work, and on one of those occasions, she asked to be fired from her job so that she could draw her unemployment benefits, which I find strange because I was not able to find an explanation as why she, ask her that, but during one of the visits to their workplace, because remember she and Ian worked at the same place, she found an envelope that belonged to Ian, which she believed contained bank robbery plans, but she never opened it to confirm that. So she took it back home and she burned it in an ashtray. 4 days after he was arrested, Myra was also arrested and charged as an accessory to Edward's murder. After the two were arrested and while being detained, police further searched the house of Wartlebrook. They found an old exercise book, and written inside was the name John Kilbride. So this led authorities to believe that they were responsible for other kids disappearing in that area. Now, Ian was adamant when he talked to the police that it was he and David who had killed Edward, and Myra had only did what he asked her to do. David told the police that Ian had asked him to get anything of his at his home and return it to him so that it wouldn't incriminate him. Well, after David took those things back to Ian, he packed them into these suitcases along with like some other items, but David wasn't sure what those items were, nor what he had done with the suitcases. But he did tell the police, they might want to check the railway stations. Well, after checking the unclaimed luggage office, the suitcases were located. Inside the suitcases, among other things, were 9 pornographic-type photos of Leslie Ann Downey, a 16-minute-long audio tape of Leslie Ann screaming, crying, and begging for her mom. Leslie Ann's poor mom even had to identify her voice and listen to that. And I would hate to have to do that, but I imagine that it was because they needed to make sure another child wasn't involved in all this, and they wanted to make sure this was Leslie Ann. But now, remember the little girl from next door that they had taken to the moors with them? Well, she was able to identify their favorite spots along the road, so police began searching, and soon they found Leslie Ann's body, which was still identifiable. Police also found photos from the moors in those suitcases, so they started using them to identify areas that possibly had graves. And on October 21st, the body of John Kilbride was located, and on that same day, Myra and Ian were charged for the murder of Leslie Ann Downey. When questioned about the circumstances pertaining to Leslie Ann, Ian told them that 2 men had brought her to their home, and those same 2 men had left with her, and when they left with her, she was still alive. Now, the court trial itself began on April 19th, 1966, and it went on for 14 days. Myra's brother-in-law, David Smith, was the prosecution's star witness. Ian and Myra both entered pleas of not guilty, and while on the witness stand, Ian testified for over 8 hours and Myra for 6. That 16-minute recording of Leslie Ann was played for the court, and like I've said in the other episodes for this series, Myra was just full of excuses or denials. She claimed that when those lewd pictures of Leslie Ann were being taken, she was looking out the window, and when the child was being undressed, she was downstairs. But yes, so yeah, we know, Myra, you had absolutely nothing to do with that or any of the other things that was committed against any of those children. Basically, she was saying she was just at the wrong place at the wrong time. But I guess the jury wasn't buying it either, because they deliberated for only a little over 2 hours, and they came back with a guilty verdict for Ian in the murders of John Kilbride, Leslie Ann Downey, and Edward Evans. And Myra was found guilty for the murders of Edward Evans and Leslie Ann Downey. Now, Ian was sentenced to 3 concurrent life sentences, while Myra was given 2 life sentences, plus 7 years to run concurrently for harboring Ian in the knowledge that he had murdered John Kilbride. And what about Pauline Reed and Keith Bennett? In 1985, Ian told a journalist that he had killed both of them, but the authorities were already suspicious of this long before his confession, mainly because both of them had lived very close to Ian and Myra, and they had disappeared around the same time as John Kilbride and Leslie Ann Downey. That same year, authorities visited Ian in prison, and when they asked him about the additional murders, he basically gave them the attitude that he was appalled that they would even suggest something like that. But they didn't let that stop them from searching the moors again. Shortly after that, Myra received a letter from Keith Bennett's mom pleading for her help, and perhaps for the first time in her life, Myra was truly moved. Keith's mom only wanted to put her little boy to rest, but authorities couldn't locate his remains in the moors. A few days after she received that letter, Myra had a visit from the police while she's in prison. Now, Myra wouldn't admit to any involvement in any murders, but she did agree to help identify possible spots by looking at the photos they had taken there. A couple of areas stood out to Myra, but she just couldn't be sure, without actually visiting the area. So after weighing the pros and cons, it was arranged for Myra to visit the area. At 4:30 a.m. on December 16, 1986, Myra left the prison by helicopter. Because there had been threats against Myra's life, police closed off all the roads to the moors and had over 200 officers patrolling the area. Myra was walked around the area until 3 that afternoon, but she had a hard time picking out locations from her memory, and there were dozens of helicopters flying above her that apparently made her nervous because, like I said, there had been death threats against her. Well, 3 days later, David Smith spent several hours on the moors with the police, helping to identify more areas to be searched, but they still had no luck. Now, the following year, Myra confessed to involvement in all 5 murders. The tape recording of her confession was over 17 hours long. But even then, she still kept up her story of never being present when the murder itself was carried out. Well, when authorities told Ian that Myra had confessed, he didn't believe them until they gave details that she had provided of Pauline's abduction. After that, Ian agreed to confess, provided he was given the means to kill himself. But of course, the authorities, they couldn't agree to that. Around that same time, Myra received another letter from Keith's mom, and in it she sympathized with the backlash that Myra had received from that visit to the moors. Myra hadn't replied to that first letter that she had received, but she did decide to write back to Keith's mom after this second letter. The following March, Myra visited the moors again. This time she didn't fly out in a helicopter, and she even spent the night at the house of a police chief in Manchester. Now, at the moors, she was unable to locate the graves, but she did confirm to the authorities that the 2 areas they had been searching were the correct areas. Well, finally, on July the 1st of that same year, Pauline Reed's body was located only 100 yards from where Leslie Ann had been located. When he found out that Pauline had been located, Ian made an official confession and agreed to help with the search for Keith Bennett. Ian was taken to the moors, but once he was there, he seemed like he had gotten confused. And even after a second trip to the moors, Ian was still unable to locate the grave or remains of Keith. Now, the 2 of them lived out their life behind bars. Myra Hindley, she died at the age of 60 on November 15, 2002 of bronchial pneumonia. And when she passed away, her reputation of being a child murderer outlived her, and it was reported that 20 local morticians refused to cremate her. Ian outlived Myra by nearly 15 years, and he passed away on May 15, 2017 from natural causes. His ashes were scattered at sea one dark night. Well, 57 years have passed since Keith Bennett was murdered, and to this day, his remains have never been located. His mom was never able to give him a proper burial before she passed away herself. Well, this ends the Moors Murder series. Join me again. I would say today, but you've probably already listened to the episode that published this morning. So come back Friday night for the What the Friday episode, and Saturday for the Weekend Weird Files. Have a good rest of your day.